In emerging economies, the role of government is even more critical, because all the governance institutions, whether it's the banking institution, the rating institution, are just not there as yet organized or mature. They have to learn through trial and error how to become more appropriate to govern business. In the meanwhile, therefore, if you don't have strong government business partnership in transforming from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, or from a communism to a capitalistic society, you need government involvement. And if there is no government involvement, it is likely to become almost an anarchy on the one hand, or the mafia elements step in. This happened in Russia after the collapse of communism, for example, and it has taken them more than a decade to correct that now. This has not happened in China. The transition in China has been much smoother from a communist doctrine-based economy to a more capitalistic economy. And it is happening somewhere in the middle when India decided, for example, to have massive economic reforms, and the transition is relatively smooth, not as smooth as one would like, but it is not anarchy on the other hand. So I do agree that government role is quite critical. India especially is such a large nation, billion plus people, quite a significant part of that population is becoming middle class. I call the rise of the new middle class in India as the call center couple. Who is a call center couple? Husband and wife both are college educated, which is very easy in India because you stay at home and the cost of going to college is just like cost of going to high school. So you already get 15, 16 years of education. But both have to work to survive, unlike the traditional society. Neither of them wants parents to live with them anymore. So there is no help in the family. Both are working and stressed out. They have no life. But what they have going for them is a massive buying power. Cell phone is a necessity. Credit card is a necessity. And they are the first-time buyers of appliances, first-time buyers of furniture, first-time buyers of automobile. And when you take the size of that economy, it becomes one of the largest consumer economies in the world. For example, cellular telephones, they are adding at least 10 million new subscribers every month. It's like 120 million net new subscribers, and we thought cell phone was a luxury. It's becoming necessity, right? Interestingly. This is not as unusual because if you go back historically, same thing happened with the rise of America about 100 years ago. When we began to get away from the agricultural society, more into industrialized, housing became the first-time buyer of homes, for example. We bought appliances first time. I have gone to General Electric Museum historically about the evolution of appliances over time. It's very fascinating. Clothing were washed by hand, at one time. Then you had a sort of, something that you pounded on, and then you had the, ringing machines, and then now you had the automatic machines and the whole bit. Same evolution you will see, except the size of India is just massive. The scarcity-driven profits is quite important to understand, because what you are doing is through mergers, acquisitions, you are consolidating and cartelizing, as we call it, the resources of the world essentially, whether those are mining resources or those are coal resources, energy resources, or those are agricultural land resources. And to me, that is very unusual. Usually we think about making more money on downstreaming value-added, branded, packaged products. Commodities are commodities, I mean, you don't make money on wheat or corn, but you make money on bread and cereals, but that's not the case anymore. across industries I have analyzed, I find fascinating, the more downstreaming value add activity, the less the margins. And the more upstreaming raw material activity, greater the margins, which is a fundamental paradigm shift. And I don't think we have understood our business principles or economic principles from that viewpoint. This has happened primarily again because of the rise of China and India as two very large emerging economies, both creating a huge middle class. So their consumption puts enormous demand on all of the raw materials, industrial raw materials to make appliances, automobiles, or agricultural raw materials like corn and wheat and barley and all the stuff that we talk about. So to me, that is the reason why there is a scarcity phenomenon taking place. In fact, all nations are now sort of thinking about food security. And we thought food was such a surplus in America, we were subsidizing the farmers, right? And we would give it out as a foreign aid, our cheese, our wheat, etc., to countries who had nothing to eat. Now it is almost reversing the process. I think this talent question is very insightful. What you have in most emerging economies is either uneducated, illiterate population, or you have a handful of very educated people who are the brain trust of the nation. They'll go abroad to study in their graduate programs, do their PhDs, and come back as scientists, bureaucrats, whatever they do. What the emerging economies need more is somewhere in the middle. What you need is an enormous skilled labor, as we call it, as opposed to unskilled labor. And you need to do that thing by giving them proper training and certification. So what we used to call in earlier days vocational technical training. Vocational technical training is probably the biggest need and a shortage of talent in all emerging economies. Plumbers, electricians, nurses are a little more than that, but physician assistants, people like that are very, very important. It's a skilled labor, but the nation has never invested into those. So that's, to me, is the biggest need and a requirement in emerging economies. Those are the kinds of jobs where is going to be almost a permanent shortage. Neither the government bureaus nor universities or vocational technical colleges or what we call community colleges are enough in supply to produce more graduates. So often what happens is start of private enterprises. Just to give you the size of this one, there is one institution in India called NIIT, National Institutes of Information Technology. And they simply open up shops for people to get computer literate. The demand for IT professionals was rising so much as a global resource, and they must have trained easily about 1 million people so far, easily. I'm underestimating, I'm sure. So that is the power, that we need probably more private sector with proper rules, regulations to expand the capacity to convert or really actually mold unskilled labor into skilled labor. There's a second area of talent that's equally important, and that is what we need in emerging economies is not the top management, but the middle managers. Middle managers always seems to be in a shortage. So you have a lot of people at the bottom of the pyramid in the workplace, basically unskilled laborers, and you have a few handful of senior executives, but somewhere in the middle, managerial rank is equally important. I feel that if you take a grain of wheat and make it into a loaf of bread, the value addition or value add is about 5 times. A raw material is about 20% of the retail price. If you take a rough diamond and polish it, a good diamond cutter can create a brilliant diamond whose market value would be about, let's say, 20 times. But if you take a human being, which is talent in the rough, and polish that talent with mentoring, educating, investing in that talent, the value add is infinite. And that's what this emerging economy has the largest pool of people who could be molded and shaped how to be good to their own family, good to themselves, good to the nation, and good to the world. And that's what we think emerging economies will contribute back to the society. I think that's very important question. How can emerging economies have other perspectives than just the US-centric or North-centric, which are all the advanced economies like Europeans, etc., is for the emerging economies to do more and more trade, investment with each other. And that's happening. The largest trading partner of India now is China. The largest trading partner of Brazil is China. China's largest markets are in Africa and in Latin America. I think these are the kinds of what we call a South-South dialogue or South-South engagement is going to become very necessary. And it is happening, fortunately. I also believe that it is not just trade and investment, which is my area of specialization, but I think having this South-South dialogue also in terms of a cultural understanding is very important. So people of emerging nations can understand that there are actually multi-shades of cultures between advanced economies and themselves. It's not all black and white. And they can relate to a whole rainbow of experiences in the process, which I think would be very valuable and very healthy to the world economy. When it comes to China and India specifically, there are such large population-based economies about to take off. China has already taken off and India is taking off. The only showstopper for their economic growth or their aspirations is the environment. It is not regulation, it's not public opinion, and we have never understood environment the right way at the beginning of the first industrial revolution. At that time, the scientists thought that environment was an inert entity, and that's because we were looking for industrial raw materials such as coal, iron, copper, etc., and we thought that is inorganic. So we thought that if we take those resources from nature, we don't have to replace them. We can exploit them, not realizing that it has a long-term consequences. Nature actually is a living, breathing organism. So the only way out for emerging economies now in the second industrial revolution to learn from the things we did wrong in the first industrial revolution, and that is the philosophy what I'm suggesting is nurturing nature. The more you nurture nature, the more it will give it back to you. So having a mindset of nurturing rather than exploitation makes all the difference. So where do we nurture? We nurture children. In the old agricultural age, children were an asset on the farm. So if I do a return on investment, I had a very good positive return in agricultural age or every child that I have. They become errand boys at a young age, they become full-fledged manpower, and they are also my retirement meal, right? They take care. There are no pension plans in those days. But if I do a net present value of having a child today, guess what? It's negative, okay? It'll cost me $250,000 to have a child, including 4 years of college education in America. And what else children give you now? They give you headaches and heartaches. So children are not the asset anymore as they used to be, right? However, I suddenly became very curious about why people worship cow. And then I did an economic analysis. Farmers always nurture their pigs, their fish, their chickens, their cows, because they know more you nurture, the more you get it back. So I did a return on investment analysis of a cow. That's very positive. Actually, over the lifetime of a cow, she gives you back so much that it is in your self-interest to nurture nature, right? And that to me is a very key message. I think these nations will learn, and fortunately, we do have the knowledge, the wisdom, the practice, and even a science now to do it right. We call it organic farming, for example, organic farming of vegetables and fruits, but also fish. We know how to replace forests, as we cut them properly. It's all possible now, right? So to me, that's clearly one major factor. A second factor why conscious capitalism will arise more out of emerging economies is because the more money you make, the more empty you become inside. It's a truism. I've seen this again and again. The most wealthy people, if they become, rather than inherit the wealth, if they got the wealth, then they become very empty inside. They want to contribute back to the society somehow, whether they create foundations on the one hand, or become, servant leadership. They go out and serve, the homeless people during Thanksgiving Day in our case, or, Easter and Christmas and whatever the holidays of the world are. I think that's very important, that if it was built into the rise of enterprises and rise of the wealth creation through capitalism, it's a much better mechanism. So what you need going forward is purpose infused into profit. A profit with purpose is more enduring, meaningful, more satisfying to the creators of wealth. I believe in both China and India, because they are really very traditional historical societies like Europe. Capitalism was never trusted anyhow. Okay? Capitalism has been never trusted by the traditional societies that arose through intellectuals. And therefore, they will always have this uneasy feeling as these two countries become capitalistic, or all emerging economies transform into economic powers. They will always have this uneasiness whether the Western capitalism model is right or wrong for us. And I experience those debates as I travel in other countries, especially emerging economies. It's a very common debate, very conscious in their mind, and therefore conscious capitalism will take its roots even stronger in emerging economies than just in the advanced economies. You are right that historically neither of these countries, neither India nor China, practiced environmentalism, conservation. Fortunately for both nations, the consumption per capita was so low, it didn't matter. But today, if you just take, for example, plastic bottles, India is all switching from tap water or a well water to plastic, bottled water, not just for tourists, but for natives. And the demand is just exploding. Now, what do you do with those plastic bottles? They have a long life. Unless you somehow recycle them and use them for other purposes, it becomes a huge environmental issue. That's so obvious to us, right? Same thing as these nations begin to have running water, hot and cold. I find running water, while it's a great convenience and benefit to us, and I'm used to it myself, but I realize that 95% of the running water that I use is a waste, whether while I'm brushing my teeth or I'm taking my shower. I really don't need that much. When we had no running water, we couldn't waste it like that. So with advancement of technology and more conveniences in life, we have an enormous waste problem. So we need to also learn how to consume smartly, how to produce smartly, how to have a smart government policy that regulates all this stuff. So my view is that as these economies explode in their growth and create the new middle class, they will have no choice. They will have to become environmentally conscious. The two nations are becoming environmentally conscious, but in two opposite ways. It's very interesting to watch these two nations in such a sharp contrast. In China, it is done through a government policy. Government says we have to worry about these things. It is not basically democratized to people to decide. In India, you have all these NGOs, non-profit, social activist people who say, we have to take care of the environment, you see. Government be damned. It's just the opposite. So they almost say, leave government alone. They will never do right, kind of attitude, We can do better without the government. In China, government is actually the creator of all these changes. And I've seen that surprisingly, I am very optimistic that China may become actually one of the lead nations in environmentalism. The biggest misconception of Americans, Europeans, and those are the primary one, is that we have the legacy of old belief systems. We want everything consistent. So when you see a country of when you see a country of roaming cows and snake charmers, you believe they cannot be in modern world. But you could have both at the same time. You could have the most modern factory and snake charmers within the same proximity. They don't think from that viewpoint. So it gives them a stereotype, what we call a self-reference criterion, and that gives them the perspective that often minimizes the importance of those nations, or actually the the advantage of those nations in terms of doing business with them. So that's clearly one. In some places, we still have the colonial mindset. There is still a colonial mindset among people. So it's the body language when you walk in and you see people who are ex-colonies, and you still see them in the same light. And I've seen that again and again, and therefore, people have told me that comment, that they can see that through pretty much. So I think, to me, that's the second thing we need to avoid primarily. The future of all advanced countries lies with emerging economies, whether we like it or not. And therefore, we must learn how to partner them well, how to invest and nurture them properly. They are our future. And that's the attitude we have to take more and more going forward. Surprisingly, the average person who travels, when they come back, they basically have forgotten their old belief systems. They realize 90% or so simply say, I'm changed. And I will give an anecdote here. At Emory University, we actually started sending faculty abroad for 2 weeks into an emerging economy like India. And we absolutely were overjoyed to see complete transformation in their mindset from before to after. Just like we do with students, study abroad programs. My view is that faculty abroad program is much more strategic and a much bigger multiplier, because one faculty teaches 30, 50, 100 students a year, and it's a permanent change in them. Then they want to talk about that in the classroom, want to do research, so it becomes a perpetuating sort of a virtuous cycle, Students are there for 1 semester or 1 year, then they graduate, and then they go and they forget, except as a personal experience. So this gets into education institutionalization, very powerful paradigm. So I do believe that at that level, there's an enormous transformation, progress. The progress seems to be in the middle somewhere among the business executives. Because most business executives, unless they are mandated to live there and manage those employees and customers, and factories, will still be more like dropping in 24 hours, from one airport to the other. So they don't experience the real world. They don't speak language quite often, For example, they have a translator, or they have some assistant who takes them around. So you are very much sort of isolated from the real world. So I do believe that it becomes absolutely crucial for businesses to mandate, encourage in a career pathing, rotational, to live and breathe in these countries till you are made into a senior most executive in a corporation. At the government level, which is the third level, I think it is the least change. One would have expected that more, but I think it's still not there. Most advanced countries' governments are driven by their own domestic issues. They worry about how these emerging economies may become their competitors. You know, the geopolitics are changing enormously. So if you look at G7, which was the Advanced Economies Forum after the first energy crisis, they added G8 Russia after the collapse of communism. But today, unless you live and breathe and work with G20 nations, including emerging economies, you are not in the real world. And that's what you saw in the last G20 meeting that took place in London, for example. So suddenly you have to deal with, as a leader of a major superpower like America, you have to deal with Brazilian president and his views, Chinese premier or president and their views, Indian prime minister, and they all have very diverse set of concerns, and they come from very diverse set of backgrounds as political leaders. And how do you accommodate their viewpoints? How do you become more pluralistic, more understanding about different perspectives, as opposed to having monolithic perspective and simply say our perspective is the right one, you know? That becomes a key issue. I think governments have to learn. They are learning faster and faster out of sheer economic necessity, but to me it is not there yet. I'm talking about all nations, advanced countries, not just America. There are about 3 to 4 key ideas that are emerging. The first idea is that there is enormous market opportunity into what one would call as below the poverty level population. Those are very intelligent consumers. If you give them the value for their money, they will buy. You cannot impose on them the traditional highly expensive branded promoted products, because they are smarter than you. But on the other hand, if you understand where they come from and think about affordability as a key issue and figure out how to create a product that is affordable to the masses and how to then make money out of those products, you know, that to me is a major new thought emerging in marketing. And the person who has created that whole thought process is a Professor C.K. Prahalad, who is a University of Michigan professor, very passionate about this thing. He actually sits on the boards of companies which are in packaged consumer goods and actually encourages them how to practice this right. The advantage of doing this is that most companies are becoming very innovative now. They never thought of doing this thing, right? So the first time they challenge their packaging and the design people, they challenge their research and scientific community to think differently, which gives an enormous opportunity for innovation and therefore a competitive advantage. So that's clearly one major theory. Second one is a professor by the name of Philip Kotler. Philip Kotler probably is what we would call as Peter Drucker of marketing, whereas Peter Drucker was the giant in management, or Paul Samuelson in economics. Philip Kotler is really our legend, and he always has innovated newer things. He is consistently ahead of the curve. For example, way back in the 70s, he articulated that one needs to understand non-profit sectors from a marketing viewpoint. They have customers, they have donors, and we need to give them the advice about how marketing can be useful to them. Who said marketing is only for appliances, automobiles, or soaps and detergents, right? And I think that was a radical thought. But how did you non-profit marketing, like for education sector, healthcare sector, museums, culture? He is a very provocative thought leader. Then he came out with the idea that nations have to market themselves. So he led that whole thought process about nation branding, nation marketing. To me, Philip Kotler is another one who is a very good thought leader. And he's already creating the next set of thought leadership theories now to say the way we will organize the marketing function itself within a company has to be very different than the traditional way we have done. Traditionally, sales, marketing, and customer support after sales never got along. Sales and marketing always had debates. And he basically says that's not good from a customer viewpoint. So he takes a customer viewpoint and wants to organize the marketing function and get more efficiency, productivity out. Then we have a young scholar. His name is V. Kumar. V. Kumar has been one of the very prolific young scholars and taken on a specific idea, which is the lifetime value of a customer. He says, don't look at a customer strictly from one-time transaction when they come to your store to buy things, but actually they buy again and again, and over time, how much economic value they can deliver to you, and treat them accordingly. Then he's able to do a lot of fancy mathematical modeling, and he's able to show that a lot of customers actually you lose money. Okay, you are over-investing in some customers, under-invest other customers. So he proposes a series of segmentation strategies to match your profitability with customer share of wallet or value, lifetime value of a customer. I think these are the three very interesting set of scholars. And the nice thing about my field is that my field is never stagnant. It's dynamic. It constantly evolves and changes. And therefore, people like me who have been teaching and researching for about 45 years seem to be still excited. We want to discover the next frontier, and still opportunities. So we tend to remain very young at heart as scholars and thinkers.